Welcome to the Chapter 1.1 overview. Today we're looking at developments in East Asia about 1200 to 1400. Here's our essential question. How do developments in China and other parts of East Asia between 1200 and 1400 reflect continuity, innovation, and diversity? So what we need to look at is the key words in the question that are helping us determine what we should focus our notes on. And I'm going to give you a heads up that we're going to look at the end here. We're going to start with continuity, innovation, and diversity. So we'll try to look at those themes and ideas as we go through the contents of the chapter. First, the relevance. Many current observers see China's star rising after about 200 years of decline. It's important for us to understand this complex nation as its actions increasingly affect us here in the U.S. There are also significant current events that are legacies of the events discussed in this chapter, such as relationships between China and East Asian countries, shown here on this map. China's tensions with Hong Kong, which struggles to maintain independence from the mainland, is an example of such conflict, the roots of which go back to the tribute system discussed in this chapter. Even today, China's influence is large, and everyone is paying attention. So to set the stage, looking back at China's ancient history, we can find some continuities that are relevant to our focus today. With a notable exception from around 500 to 200 BCE, China has been ruled by a succession of hereditary dynasties. The controlling philosophy for the system of government came from the ideas of Confucius, who emphasized hierarchy and stability as a government's first responsibility. In the Confucian world, you have two jobs to do. Set a good example for the person below you and follow the example of the person above you. If everyone does this, harmony will prevail. And harmony is the number one goal. These ideas serve China well in time of threats from outside world. Nomadic groups like the Huns, Manchurians, and the Mongols, more about them in a future chapter, challenged China's self-government. Fortunately for China, their economic power made them more appealing as a trading partner than a potential conquest. So the first section is called Government Developments in the Song Dynasty, and the Song ruled from, as you can see here, about 960 to 1279. The previous empire shrunk due to an invasion from Manchuria. So Manchuria is this region up here in the north of what is currently China. The Manchurians invaded the Tang dynasty, which was bigger than the Song shown here, and established rule called the Jin dynasty around this time period. So we're looking at the Song dynasty, which is down here in the southern part of the map that we're looking at. This is a good section to discuss continuities. If you look back at the setting in the stage section, the key points in that section are... This is a good section to discuss continuities. If you look back at the setting the stage section, the key points in this section are carried over from previous dynasties. Rule by an emperor, a strict hierarchy based on the teachings of Confucius, and an emphasis on order and harmony all helped to make the Song dynasty a stable government system for over 300 years. The chart shown here demonstrates how power trickled down from the emperor to subordinates. So just so we're clear, in a bureaucracy, you have the emperor at the top, and then there are departments. And we see these titles here, which are just under the emperor. And then down here, we start to get into our departments: personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, public works. And you can imagine a department shown here like public works would have further departments under it. You know, this chart could keep going. And we could have a person in charge of public works for trade, for instance. And we'll talk about the Grand Canal in a few minutes here. And that would be an example of a public work. And the person building the Grand Canal would have people under them who are in charge of different parts of building the Grand Canal, and it would go all the way down to the lowest worker in the hierarchy. And it does help to keep things organized. A significant change, or innovation, remember that from the essential question, is the decision by the Emperor Song Taizu, shown here, to open up the examination system to candidates from all social classes. Remember, the examination system was a test that you took that enabled you, if you passed it and did well on it, to join this bureaucracy we see here. Villages would often pool their money to send a talented member to take the exam, for if he succeeded, he would enter into the highest class of Chinese society. China's meritocracy was unique in the world at that time, though it is important to note that it was unusual for a lower class person to enter the bureaucracy, and that most government officials came from the wealthiest classes. Next, economic developments in post-classical China. Notice that I highlighted it green to remind us that there's going to be a lot of economic stuff going on here. Much of China's political longevity can be attributed to its economic success, for governments, of course, require money to function, and the main source of this money was taxation of economic activity. Some major developments during the Song dynasty included the expansion of the Grand Canal, begun in earlier times, but eventually covering, at this time period, over 30,000 miles. This internal transportation system helped move goods from China's ports and trading cities throughout the empire, centuries before trains and airplanes. So the idea with the Grand Canal is that here's Hangzhou, which we'll talk about in a bit. This is a major port coming in here, and with the canal, you can link all of these areas by river and waterway and move goods that are coming into the port throughout the region. One major factor that helped with economic expansion during this time was a growing population, made possible by the introduction of a new, higher-yielding form of rice from China. One major factor that helped with economic expansion during this time was a growing population, made possible by the introduction of a new, higher-yielding form of rice from Vietnam. Rice from the Champa Kingdom grew faster than what China had been using, and combined with the technique of terracing, shown here, increased food production. When you have more food, your population grows, as shown on the graph. More population increases demand for goods, which stimulates more production, which creates a demand for more jobs, and the cycle continues. Just so we can see on the map here, this map goes all the way back to 950 and to 1250. Right here is the start of the Southern Song dynasty, and it's during this time period, see this growth right here, that the Champa rice is introduced. And when the Mongols conquered China, which we'll talk about later, they weren't too concerned with the people of China, and while there was some prosperity, there's definitely a population decline due to that. China was also an early leader in manufacturing, pioneering the production of steel, shown here on the top, and other goods. The prefix proto means original, so the term Proto Industrialization means an early or original form of factory production. At this time, the factory system that we know of from the Industrial Revolution did not exist, so the production of steel for bridges, guns, and other means was done at a small scale at home. The Chinese also invented the compass, shown here, which aided in navigation on the seas, helping to shorten voyages between ports and increasing profits. So we've got Indian Ocean trade down here on this map. So here's India in the center. China, of course, is up here. And the compass is going to make this navigation possible. In the early years of trade, if you look at some of this, these red lines are kind of hugging the coastline. And that's kind of how they developed at first, because the navigators lacked the knowledge to navigate across the open ocean. But now, with the use of the compass and the knowledge of these monsoon winds, that's what these arrows are showing, they're able to cross the open ocean and make the journey faster. And of course, if you're traveling faster between ports, you are trading more goods. Finally, in the economic theme, we have taxes and tributes. Major public works projects, like the Great Wall, were originally built by citizens paying a labor tax. Each family may be required to send one son to work on the wall for 2 months a year. Because it was a tax, they were not paid. During the Song dynasty, this policy was changed so that workers were paid. They could then take this money home to buy goods, and the increasing purchases stimulated the economy. This growth made China's goods attractive to other countries like Japan, and China developed the tribute system to demonstrate its superiority. Traders were required to kowtow to the emperor, shown here, in order to trade with China. This ritual was meant as a reminder that at this time, China was the world's economic powerhouse. So now we have pink at the top because we're moving on to social structures. All this economic activity led to urbanization, or an increasing percentage of the population living in cities, as people moved there to trade, work, and seek social advancement. During the Song dynasty, China contained several cities of over 100,000 people. If you see on the graph here, that's a huge contrast to some of the cities in Europe. Around the year 1200, London had about 20,000 people, Rome about 30,000, and we estimate that Hangzhou, which is a city that Marco Polo visited, had about 1 million. When Marco Polo visited, he called Hangzhou the finest and noblest city in the world. Much of this urban expansion was due to the leadership of the government and its officials. As we have learned, the bureaucracy expanded under Emperor Song Taizu, creating a new elite class of scholar officials who had more authority than landowning nobles, shown here on the pyramid at the top. China's social hierarchy was somewhat unique in that it placed peasant farmers as a higher status than merchants, even though merchants were generally much more wealthy. This is because farmers were seen as making more of a contribution to society through food production than merchants, who were necessary but made money off the labor of others. As we have seen, a social class based on Confucian ideas is very patriarchal. Women spent their lives subservient to men, as you can see with the 3 obediences here. A woman would spend her life subservient to a man, her father when she's younger, her husband when she's married, and a woman would be subservient to her son as he matured into adulthood. The ultimate expression of the subordination of women is the custom of foot binding, which was popular during the Song dynasty. While it declined in favor, this photo from the early 20th century gives a sense of how painful it must have been. This vision of female beauty was painful and debilitating, showing that social harmony sometimes comes at a price. So we have orange for intellectual and cultural developments. The growth of the scholar official class was fueled by China's advancements in paper making and printing. Chinese inventors developed paper as early as the 2nd century, but books had to be copied by hand. Around the 7th century, China developed woodblock printing, in which blocks are carved for each page of a book, shown here in the picture. Multiple pages of a book can then be printed at once. While tedious, this was much faster than handwriting, and the greatest advancement in printing until the Gutenberg printing press about 300 years later. So just to connect this to the scholar official class, the more books you have, the more readily available all those ideas are, and the more advancement can happen intellectually in that class, and it's also helping fuel all of the innovation in China. Religious diversity in China. By the end of the Song dynasty, Chinese society was influenced by a rich variety of religions and philosophies, notably Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. The Buddhist faith originated in India based on the spiritual journey of Siddhartha Gautama, who came to be known as the Buddha, which means enlightened one in Sanskrit. Born a prince, the Buddha left Indian society and devoted his life to meditation and an individual pursuit of spiritual peace. Brought to China along the Silk Roads by the 6th century, Buddhism grew in popularity during times of political turmoil. China had its own spiritual tradition that was similar to Buddhism. Based on the life and writings of the poet Lao Tzu, Taoism also encouraged a personal spiritual journey. These two ideas were combined in a syncretic religion known as Zen Buddhism, which is still popular today. And please note on the bottom here the definition of the word syncretism. It's one of those kind of history words that we'll be talking about a lot. In this case, the example, the separate concepts that are combined would be the Indian tradition of Buddhism with the Chinese tradition of Taoism into a form of Buddhism that we call Zen Buddhism. As Zen Buddhism spread throughout China, emperors increasingly saw it as a threat to the stable social order that emphasized Confucian obedience to others. Spiritual leaders, such as the founder of Zen Buddhism shown here, did not conform to traditional Chinese ideas. So you can see this guy's meditating in a cave, and remember in the Confucian bureaucratic tradition, you are supposed to follow the direction of the person above you and set a good example for the person below you. And so this idea of going off by yourself and meditating in a cave and going on a spiritual, personal journey didn't really fit in very well with that idea, and that's why it was seen as a threat. However, the Chinese philosophy of yin and yang allows for opposite ideas to coexist, so many Chinese follow Confucian ideas at work and Buddhist ideas at home, because the idea in the yin and yang is not to choose one idea, but to balance opposite ideas. And so Buddhism and Confucianism were able to coexist because of that foundational Chinese philosophy. Encouraged by scholar officials, Neo-Confucianism combines some of the ideas of Buddhism and Taoism while focusing on more practical matters of social responsibility. Now we're going to compare Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, and remember diversity was one of those words from the essential questions, so here we'll be looking at a comparison. So China had an influence on 3 neighboring states, and we'll start with Japan. Japan was more independent of Chinese influence than Korea and Vietnam, largely due to the buffer of ocean between them. A Japanese prince named Shotoku Taishi, that's him in the middle here, admired the organization of China's government and sent scholars to study with their Chinese counterparts. The travelers brought back Confucian ideas, and Japan's imperial state soon copied many of the bureaucratic systems. Japan enjoyed central rule during the Heian period and continued to be influenced by China's culture and politics. In the 12th century, war broke out among rival families, and the Minamoto clan seized power from a declining imperial state, establishing rule by shogun, which lasted for centuries. And that's the first Minamoto shogun shown in the bottom right. In the rule by shogun, it was a rival clans that was ruling, not the original emperor. In Korea, the shared border with the Jin, or Northern Song, Empire intensified China's influence. Through its economic interactions with China, Korea adopted many of the same Chinese traditions as Japan. It's clear why elites would choose Confucianism and peasants Buddhism. If you remember from our earlier slides, Confucianism is about keeping the power structure the way that it is. So if you're an elite class member, you're going to want to keep things the way that they are. Buddhism is a bit more rebellious, in which anybody can achieve enlightenment if they go off and leave that society and go on a spiritual journey of enlightenment. So if you're a lower class peasant, you might be more inclined to do that. One key difference between Korea and China was that the strong hold landowners had on the social hierarchy prevented lower-class candidates from joining the bureaucracy as they did in China. Finally, in Vietnam, we see a key difference compared with the other two, with greater resistance to Chinese control. A famous early rebellion was led by the Trung sisters, pictured here, leading rebels on war elephants. Vietnam's government was more decentralized than China's, Japan's, or Korea's, making it a higher priority for the people to resist direct rule from a foreign, centralized power. Thus, Vietnam continued the fight and eventually ended Chinese control. So for our review slide, we're going to go back to our essential question and look at some of the examples from this chapter that help us answer that question. So we started with continuity. In the political idea, we have, especially in China, but also in other places, the idea of a bureaucratic government system, a test that you take to join that government class, and rule by a central government. And that's mostly in China, the centralized government. We have Confucianism and patriarchy as social continuities, and China's position throughout this time period as the economic power of Asia. Innovation, those were new ideas by people. There was a lot about technology in this chapter, such as steel, paper, gunpowder, and the compass, all in China. And a social innovation was this Chinese meritocracy, the idea that a poor person could rise up the ranks by working hard and through his talent. And then for diversity, some of the comparisons we saw in that last section, not all of them, but some of them, were the fact that China and Korea had centralized rule while Japan and Vietnam had decentralized rule, and the fact that women in Vietnam had more status than they did in Korea, Japan, and China. That's your overview for Chapter 1.1. Happy studying!